and welcome to DHF Elder Update. I'm Doug Harvey, Executive Director of DHF, and your host for these updates. When most of us read the Ten Commandments and see the prohibition against idolatry, we feel pretty safe. We don't keep idols of foreign gods around our houses or our churches. We certainly don't worship it. But sometimes churches and Christians unintentionally fall into what I call functional idolatry. It's not intentional, but anytime we allow something to take the place or the priority of the living God in our lives, we've actually turned that something into an idol, whether we call it that or not. Nobody intends it this way, but over time, people sometimes have traditions, objects, ways of doing things, memories of past times when they've been close to God that actually hold them back from living out the call of God in their lives today. Think of it in terms of physical objects. Sometimes a church reaches a place where it needs to move into a different building or make a major remodeling of the church building that they're in. Whenever those kind of discussions come up, almost inevitably, someone says, we may have to build another building, we may have to remodel this one, but there's one thing we're not going to change in this building, and then they name it. It could be a lot of things, but there's something in that building, something about the way that building's put together, the color of the sanctuary, something that is just non-negotiable for those folks. When buildings change, for instance, sometimes it can be the stained glass. Somebody will announce, my grandparents gave that window over on the south corner, and we're not going to leave it. We're not going to change it. It's simply going to be there as long as this church is a church. And what they're really saying, if they thought about it, is that piece of stained glass is more important to them than fulfilling the mission God has given the church in that day and time. Now, I'm not trying to say you should never take stained glass with you or that stained glass is somehow evil, but it can become an idol. I've known churches that couldn't move to a better building because of memories attached. You know, this church has been standing since 1901, and it just wouldn't be Old First Church if we didn't, you know how that goes. And sometimes a church can't step into a fresh future because it's lost trying to preserve a glorious past. And rather than trying to move forward with God into the next era of the church's life, people get consumed with trying to recreate a wonderful golden era that once was and never will be again. And once again, even that memory can become an idol. Churches and individuals who slip into idolatry unintentionally do it because they're trying to fulfill their desire for God and think they can do it with a substitute. Now, again, nobody means to, but it's easy to substitute, for instance, church activity for a living relationship with God. Church activity is a lot easier to measure, to see, than an abstract relationship with a God you can't measure or see. And so folks sometimes just fall into that because it's the only way they can quantify what they're doing for God or feel right about it because they can put a handle on it. What happens to folks like that is that the church itself, their work in the church, or objects that are associated with their work in the church actually become substitutes for the God about whom those objects and ideas were supposed to be in the first place. Sometimes people who don't have a living relationship with God find great comfort from memories of times they felt closer to God. And when that happens, then we begin to associate being close to God with activities or objects that remind us of those times. If the last time you really felt close to God was during an old-fashioned revival meeting with the old tinkly piano playing the classic revival hymns. There's going to be something about that draws your heart back. And if your relationship with God isn't current, isn't warm and close, sometimes hearing those old songs is the only thing you've got to cling to. And so rather than go out and develop the living relationship, you begin to hang up on those memories, those objects, those songs that remind you of those times. Now, what do we do when people fall in, intentionally or unintentionally, into some form of idolatry in the church? How can we fight that? Well, I want to say, first of all, we can't talk people out of those associations. That's usually what people do. We've all heard the conversation many times. We all have idols in our lives, and then we try to rub people's nose in it and make them feel bad for the things they allow to substitute for Christ. Very rarely does that actually motivate change. Makes you feel good for rubbing people's nose in it sometimes, but it doesn't lead people to change. What we can do is preach, teach, and live the real thing. A living, present time, vital relationship with a living God. See, we can learn to be close to Him and show others what that looks like. We can talk about our walk with God. We can encourage folks along the way. We can assure that our worship, that our church activities, that the lives we live in our families and workplaces are all Christ-centered, and show how our hearts are drawn to Him. And we help people get free from idolatry by lifting up the real thing, the living God who redeems us through Christ and empowers us through the Holy Spirit. Without that, people will still cling to their idols because it's better than nothing. Elders, pastors, lead your people. Lead them by growing close to God yourself, so that there's a model out there in the church's top leadership of what it means to live close to God. Demonstrate the real thing. And the temptation to turn to idols really falls by the wayside. The real thing drowns out the counterfeit. A warm, fuzzy feeling from a stained glass window just pales in comparison to the light of Christ shining into our hearts here and now. A few moments in heartfelt worship here and now will drown out the memories of good heartfelt worship way back when. We lead our people away from functional idolatry far more effectively by modeling the real thing than we do by attacking the counterfeits. Pastors, elders, live the real thing. Teach the real thing. Model the real thing. And you'll draw people far more effectively to a living relationship with Christ than you ever will by attacking their functional idolatry. Help your flock find the real thing. I'm Doug Harvey, and this is DHF Elder Update.